did everything right. And still, even after you put your best effort in, the bottom falls out. My wife and I were living in Texas for many years. We had moved there to start our doctorates. I'm working on a PhD in Old Testament, and I am going to finish someday in my life. Finish my comps. My wife is working on she's studying at Texas A&M, and someone congratulate her someday. Don't need to clap her hand, but she is in her. It's been 3 years. She's in her last set of classes. She went from a bachelor's degree, skipped out on the master's, went all the way to the PhD, and she's going to be entering her dissertation phase pretty soon. So get my wife back. But we moved there to do coursework. I was working on campus and there at Southwestern and helping out my professor. She was studying at Texas A&M, and life was hard for us in those days. You know, we were both working from home. I was working part-time at the college, and we both had online jobs. We were homeschooling our children at the same time. So 2 PhDs, homeschooling our kids and working from home. It was a lot to take in. And we began to pray whether God wanted us to make a change in our life. We decided to move back to Pensacola. Amy's sister lives here. We both went to college here. This is where Amy and I met. And her parents were beginning to get ready for retirement. They were moving down to Pensacola. Actually, they moved to Milton at the time. So we felt that it was time to make a move, and we had an online job, so we could move. There would be no trouble there. And we began to make preparations. We gave the 2-month notice that our lease required. We started to disassemble the kids' playground, sold all that off, sold the trampoline. Some furniture we'd bought there, got rid of that, and we were getting ready to move. And we found a home here in the Pensacola area to rent, long distance, in the middle of a housing boom. And so everything it was an exciting time for us to get to move closer to family. A few weeks before we moved, Amy and I heard some things going on in our company, some changes that were being made, and they had started to go through some challenges because of COVID. We didn't really see that affecting us, so we weren't too concerned. We filled up our moving truck, got on the road, and started our new life here in Pensacola, or Milton actually. 4 days after moving, starting a new lease, we had to pay double the security deposit just because we hadn't met the people, so they wanted more of assurance that everything would be okay. 4 days after moving here, we lost our jobs. We were living in a new home, started a new life, and both of us were unemployed. I'm sure all of us can relate to some time in our life when that happened. You know, a change in career, or you step into a new role, some new opportunity comes up. And it's an exciting time, but with new opportunities, those often bring new challenges. Maybe you know someone who prayed for years for a child. You know, the family, they wanted to get pregnant, and you know, I hear this story often. You know, you try and try and try. You do everything the doctor says. The timing's right. You take all the medication, and still, it seems to just not go your way. And finally, she conceives, right? She goes to the doctor 2 months in, only to find out that that pregnancy is high risk. You know, you do everything right, and then the bottom falls out. College students feel this way. You know, they go off to college, they're so excited, such a new phase in life, so much anticipation until they arrive. And then they start to get homesick, and the bills start to pile up. You know, it's new opportunities and yet new challenges. The Christian life, it works that way sometimes, doesn't it? We like to sing that chorus, every day with Jesus is sweeter than the day before. And yet, there are stretches throughout life when it seems as though every day with Jesus, it gets harder than the day before. One day you're striving along, walking down God's path for your life. And then out of nowhere, suddenly, you know, you're at a fork in the road, and it's dark, and it's like you don't have any direction, you don't know where to go. And it's in times like those, you know, you can wonder, God, all I wanted to do was obey you. All I wanted to do was follow you, and yet now my life, it looks like it's a wreck. And you ask God, you know, what is happening to me? Why is this happening? What are you going to do when obstacles to your faith arise? How will you respond when the bottom falls out? That is the question of our text this morning. Will you trust God when problems come, when troubles come your way? Or will you try to effect your own deliverance and go your own way? We're beginning a series on one man's life of faith. And last week we saw God make some exciting promises to this person. God promised him a family. He promised him a land. And he's promised that God said, I will bless the entire world through you if you will step out into the unknown by faith. And we saw last week as this man trusted God and he went from the familiar to the unfamiliar. He left his family. He left everything with nothing but a promise. And as Hebrews 11:10 tells us, by faith he dwelt in the land of promise as in a foreign country, dwelling in tents. For he waited for the city, which has foundations, whose builder and maker is God. And you get done with that. And as you get to Genesis 12:9, you're like, wow, what faith. I mean, here's a guy, he had nothing but a canteen and a promise. What an amazing man of faith. But no sooner does this man enter the land that God had promised him before things begin to take a turn. And a challenge arises in his family. And he's faced with the question to what is he going to do? Whether to trust God and continue walking by faith, or to be afraid and to try to effect his own deliverance. You're open to Genesis 12. As we finished up last week, Abram, I might make that mistake again. Abram had entered the land, and we read in verse 6, Genesis 12:6, that Abram passed through the land to the place of Shechem, as far as the terebinth tree of Morah, and the Canaanites were then in the land. And everywhere that Abram went, he saw the Canaanites. Everywhere he went, everywhere he camped, he witnessed the debauchery and the wickedness of this culture. No matter where Abraham traveled, he could hear their scoffing and their mockery as they watched him build his altars to Yahweh. And as he preached, and yet still, Abram continues to walk with the Lord. And he stays in the land. He moves around the land of Canaan that God had promised him. Verse 9, Abram journeyed, going on still toward the south. And everything is going well at this point. God had blessed him, especially, did God bless him in Haran before entering Canaan. And then suddenly things begin to change, because we read in verse 10 of a drought that sets in throughout Canaan. Genesis 12:10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abram went down to Egypt to dwell there, for the famine was severe in the land. Now, today, when we want to emphasize something, we have a lot of ways to do this. You can bolden things. You can underline something. We have highlighters, right? You can put something in italics. You can even all cap something. There are many ways of drawing emphasis today. In the Bible, especially in the Old Testament, however, when you want to draw emphasis, when God has a biblical writer emphasize something, one way they do this is by repetition. You all know the verse, right? In Isaiah 6, right? When Isaiah saw the Lord, and what did the cherubim say as he was looking at the Lord? Holy, 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 right? Repetition. How about Genesis 1, verse 26? Who can think of that verse? No, don't raise your hand. Genesis 1:26 and 27. God had created the heavens and the earth. In fact, all throughout that chapter, created, made, repeating all throughout the chapter. But listen to Genesis 1, 26 and 27. Then God said, let us make man in our image, according to our likeness, he repeats it. Verse 27, so God created man in his own image. Repeats it. In the image of God, he created him. And then he repeats it. Male and female, he created them. And through that repetition, you see the emphasis that God made man in his likeness and in his image. Repetition is a way to draw emphasis. You know, one of the best instances I have found, and I found a lot of them in the Bible, of this way of emphasizing something through repetition. It's actually a pretty comical one. It's Exodus 14. Do you remember Exodus 14, the crossing of the Red Sea? If you study that passage closely, there's something that is repeated all throughout Exodus 14. In fact, it's repeated no less than 8 times. In Exodus 14, as you read God bringing Israel across the Red Sea, he says, he repeats time and again that the reason he's doing this was so that Pharaoh and his army, and he's specific, his chariots and his horsemen and all of his hosts might know that God is the Lord. Exodus 14:4 says, so that God would gain honor over Pharaoh and over his army, and that the Egyptians may know that I'm Lord. And you recognize through this instance of repetition that God was bringing Israel across the Red Sea, not just to deliver them, but to be honored by Pharaoh and his horsemen, and his chariots, and all of his hosts. And he says that time and again and again and again and again. And what's the point? When the Bible wants to emphasize something, it repeats it. Did you notice in the verse we read in Genesis 12 how many times land came up? We read in Genesis 12 that verse 10, now there was a famine in the land, and Abraham went to dwell in Egypt because the famine was severe in the land. It repeats it. In fact, Genesis 12 has been repeating this word land for quite some time now. Genesis 12:1, now the Lord said to Abram, get out of your country, from your family, and from your father's house, to a land that I will show you. Skip down to verse 4. So Abram departed. Where did he go? To the land of Canaan. So they came to the land of Canaan. 2 times in that verse. Verse 6. Abraham passed through the land. The end of the verse says, and the Canaanites were then in the land. And then verse 7. And the Lord appeared to Abram and said, to your descendants I will give this land. So far we have observed 6 times in these verses land coming up, and each time it is speaking of God's promise. This land is something God has promised to give Abram. Happens to me all the time. And yet now the land is a problem. The land that God had promised is a problem. Because there is a famine in the land. Now, on the surface, there's nothing unusual about a famine, right? If you recognize where this land is, the land of Canaan, it was a semi-arid land. It doesn't take much for famine conditions to happen in places like Canaan. This was quite normal. It was common to have difficult years, times where crops would not grow. And when that happens, what happens? Well, there's not enough food to go around. And so that kind of makes sense. I think Abraham, he did the natural thing. It's the thing that most of us would probably do when we're struggling to feed our family. He leaves the land of Canaan for the land of Egypt. Now, I don't think he was leaving Canaan forever. If Abram wanted to leave Canaan forever, he could have gone back to Haran or gone back to his homeland. He doesn't do that. He goes down to the land of Canaan. Why? Because he planned to go back. That's my guess. And you see that in verse 10 where it says that he went to dwell there for a while. That word dwell, it's the word that's translated often sojourn. It's the idea of living somewhere for a while. It's the same word that comes up in the book of Ruth in chapter 1, when Ruth and her family went from the land of Canaan to the land of Moab. They went to sojourn there, and they were there for 10 years. But they were living somewhere, not as citizens, not as in a place where they had family. They were aliens in a land that was not theirs. They were sojourning there. And that is what is going on here. Abram is leaving Canaan for Egypt as an alien. And on a human level, going to a place like Egypt, that makes sense as well. I mean, think about it. Egypt was in the delta region where the Nile River was. And that river broke off into all sorts of different channels, all rich and full of water. Egypt was always very fertile. There was always food available in Egypt. Now, we know of an exception of that when we read in the book of Genesis when God intervenes. But for the most part, while other countries would experience drought, Egypt never experienced things like this on a regular basis. Things were much more stable in Egypt. So from that way, it also makes sense that he would go down into Egypt. But as we start to dig deeper, when we get beneath the words of the text, and we begin to listen to what is going on beneath the surface of the story, we recognize that something else is at work here. Because what Abram didn't know, and what Genesis hasn't told us, but what we will find out later when we get to Deuteronomy, is that God had specifically picked Canaan because it was not fertile like Egypt. God had chosen the land of Canaan because they would have to trust in him for the rain, because Canaan was a place where they would have to live by faith. Turn with me, if you will. You don't have to. I can read it. To Deuteronomy chapter 11. I want to show you something here. Deuteronomy 11. I'm going to read a few verses here in verse 10 going down to verse 12. Why did God pick the land of Canaan? Well, Moses says in Deuteronomy 11, speaking of Abraham's descendants, children of Israel, the land which you are going to possess, it's not like the land of Egypt, from which you have come, where you sowed your seed and watered it by foot as a vegetable garden. I'm in Deuteronomy 11 now, verse 11. But the land which you cross over to possess is a land of hills and valleys, which drinks water from the rain of heaven. Verse 12, a land for which the Lord your God cares. The eyes of the Lord your God are always on it, from the beginning of the year to the very end of the year. And so as you read and understand a passage like that, you recognize that God was at work here. And it becomes pretty clear that when you look at this famine in the land, that this famine is a test. God is testing Abram. You know, God often does that, doesn't he? God will make a promise to his people, and then something comes along that'll place question marks against that promise, where that promise now it appears so unstable, so fragile. But Christian, these times of uncertainty, these times of testing, they follow triumph. And that pattern, testing following triumph, it comes up all throughout the Bible. You and me, we were looking at Exodus 14 a moment ago. Do you remember God had drawn them out of Egypt? He had rescued them from Egypt. No sooner did he rescue them from Egypt than what? They end up at the corner at the Red Sea. Triumph was followed by a test. God parts the sea and he brings them across. And would you know, in the very next chapter, as soon as they get across the river, God brings another test. Because you hear them murmuring, there is no water. Testing followed triumph. You think of Jesus in Mark 1, right? Jesus is there, and in verse 11, God says, you are my beloved Son, in whom I am well pleased. Did you know in the very next verse, no sooner does Mark record that record for us, that Jesus is immediately thrown into the wilderness, where he's tempted by the devil for 40 days and 40 nights. You know, you can go on forever with this. In chapter 4, you find the disciples. They're sitting under the teaching of the Lord, learning the parables, and it's a mountaintop experience. And yet, when you get to 4:35, in verse 35, you read, on the same day, they cross over Galilee to go to the other side. And you remember what happens that evening when the storm comes. And that famous record, Master, Master, help us, we perish. Testing came after triumph. And I have so many more examples here where that takes place in the life of God's people. You know, I heard a story not too long ago of a group of Christian men. They started a Christian school. They had felt that God wanted them to open a Christian school. They had the funds. They brought the kids in, and they started the school. And they felt this is what God wanted them to do. About the 6th or 7th year, they had run out of money. There was nothing left in the bank. And it seemed like God was having them close the school. And they didn't understand why. You know, God delivered them in the end, and things worked out for them. But it was a time of testing. A time of struggle. These are times when God tests us. This famine in Genesis 12, it's a test. And it's one Abraham doesn't do too well with. Abraham fails this test. And he loses track of God's promise. And he takes things into his own hands. Without asking God, he heads off on his own. And from here, things just get worse. Because as he's traveling from Canaan to Egypt, he realizes pretty quickly that he's in some trouble. Verse 11. And when he was close to entering Egypt, and it came to pass when he was close to entering Egypt, that he said to Sarai, his wife, indeed, I know that you are a woman of beautiful countenance. Therefore, it will happen when the Egyptians see you that they will say, this is his wife, and they will kill me, but they will let you live. Please say you're my sister, that it may be well with me for your sake, and that I might live because of you. Can you stop and think about his logic here? I mean, it's almost comical. I mean, Sarah, listen, look, I know you're beautiful. By the way, man, it's a good thing to remind your wife of that sometimes. So she knows that you know she's beautiful. I think this is a great thing that Abraham does here in this verse. He says, Sarah, I know you're beautiful. That part, by the way, is what I thought was great. Not what's coming next. But I have concerns for my life. Look, these people, they are godless people. They're going to take one look at you, and they're going to say, you know, this is his wife. If we want to get to her, we're going to have to get rid of him. Here's the deal. Just tell them I'm your brother, so that I will live because of you. Don't you? What a guy. I mean, wow. His solutions, in those days, it kind of makes sense. I mean, if somebody wanted to get close to a woman and she had a brother, right? In order to get close to them, they would shower blessings on him, right? So in that way, Abram's thinking through this, and he's trying to find a way to live, right? And, you know, here's the question that often comes up. You know, is Abraham really lying here? Because, you know, we're going to find out in a moment that she is his half-sister. And so the question is, I mean, was it really a full-fledged lie? Of course it was a lie. I mean, think about it. It's not about what he was trying to, it's not about what Abram said. It's about what he's trying to hide. If I were to sell you a car, right? And I tell you, you know, I just fixed the computer board on the car. It's a brand new computer board. Now that's true, right? I wasn't lying. What I didn't tell you is this is the third time this year I've had to replace that board, and I'm trying to unload this thing on you before this money pit gets any worse. Now, was that a lie? Of course it was a lie. It wasn't what I said, it was what I left out. But, you know, this text, it's not so much about Abraham's dishonesty here. Because sometimes I think we put these people on pedestals. You know, we look at a guy like David and we forget that he's a murderer. And we look at someone like Abraham, we can't understand how a guy like this could lie. This man of faith, as though somehow these men are better than us. And they don't make the same mistakes that we make every day of our life. course, Abraham lied. And this isn't the last time he's going to fail. But the focus of this text is not so much the lie. The real issue here is Abram's disobedience. It's his unbelief. Do you remember God's promise to him? God said at the beginning of the chapter, I will bless those who bless you, and I will curse those who curse you. Had Abraham been trusting God, he would have known that God would never have allowed Pharaoh to do the things that he was suggesting. Had Abram been trusting God, he would have thought, I don't know how God is going to do it, but I know that God is going to protect Sarai. I know that God is going to protect me. But Abraham doesn't do that. Instead of trusting the Lord and walking by faith, Abram leans and relies on his own understanding. And what's so interesting here is, as he goes off on his own, and you read in verse 14, it kind of proves his point. It's kind of odd here. His fears come true. Look at verse 14. So it was, when Abram came into Egypt, that the Egyptians saw the woman, that she was very beautiful, just as he'd said. Don't you just love that? I mean, I could just see Abram, he's sitting here. See what I mean? I told you this was going to happen. You ever do the wrong thing, and then you use your circumstances to justify what you were doing? I mean, it's incredible. Young people, they do this all the time. They rationalize their actions. They say, you see what happened? Look, I told you this was going to happen. You see, here we go. I was right. I can just see what's going on in Abraham's head here. And things get even stranger in verse 16, because after Abram is disobedient, God still allows blessings to come his way. Look at verse 16. It says he treated Abram well for her sake, just as Abraham said. He had sheep and oxen and male donkeys and male and female servants, female donkeys and camels. And his plan works. Sort of. Because as you continue to read through this text, you recognize that while Abraham saves his own life, the plan backfires. And it happens just like that, when we walk away from God. Soon the dominoes begin to fall. Someone wrote on this text, they said, when you find yourself scheming to escape problems with other people, just beware, because worse trouble is coming. Look here. It turns out to be true with Abram. Verse 15 says this, the princes of Pharaoh saw her and commanded her to Pharaoh, and the woman was taken to Pharaoh's house. Abraham might have delivered himself, but in the end, he doesn't just jeopardize his wife, Sarai, but he jeopardizes the promised seed. He places God's promise at risk. Do you see that? This becomes one of the lowest moments of Abraham's life of faith. And as you move through his life, you're going to find that every time Abram loses track of God and his promises, he does something either stupid or sinful. But you know what's so encouraging about this text? Because that's not all Genesis 12 shows me. Up to this point in the text, we've been focusing on Abram. And as readers, we do that sometimes. We focus on the actions of the people of the text. And that's a good thing, to look at the actions of these people. It's a biblical thing. I mean, Hebrews spends the entire 11th chapter focusing on the faith that these men have. But this story is not just about Abram's failure. It shows us something else. Because even though Abram deserted God, even though Abram leaves Canaan, you recognize in this story that God never deserted him. He never forsook Abram. He remained faithful even when Abram lost faith. And he intervenes in verse 17. And when he does that, everything begins to change. Verse 17, but the Lord plagued Pharaoh and his house with great plagues because of Sarai, Abram's wife. Up to now, it's been all about Abram and what he's doing. But now you recognize that God has been working behind the scenes the whole time. And he has been protecting Sarai. He plagues Pharaoh and his family. And there's so many interesting things about this text. Somehow Pharaoh recognizes that. Abram didn't recognize it, but Pharaoh does. He knows that something's going on here. He recognizes that God had brought these plagues upon him because of Sarah. We're not told why, but he rebukes Abram for his dishonesty. Verse 18, and Pharaoh called Abram and said, what is this you have done to me? Why did you tell me that she was your wife? Why did you say, she is my sister? You know, it's a sad thing when those who don't know the Lord are being used by God to rebuke his children for their unbelief. It's incredible, isn't it? You know, I think of Jonah. He was running from God, God's prophet. You know, didn't want to go to Nineveh. Gets on that ship and he's off there and the storm comes. Where was he? He was sleeping at the bottom of the ship. Were the sailors sleeping? Oh, no. Do you remember what they said about the storm? They recognized that this was coming from God. Those sailors put it together. They knew that God was doing work, and yet Jonah, he didn't have a clue. And Pharaoh recognized it too. Verse 20, so Pharaoh commanded his men concerning him, and they sent him away with his wife and all that he had. And you look at this story and you realize that God's love for Abraham, despite his unbelief, it goes on. He took care of him and he took care of Sarah and he delivers them from Pharaoh. And Abram returns to Canaan, a wealthy man. And so as you go home today and you think about Genesis 12, you recognize that this text is teaching us that sometimes God will allow famine to come into our lives. Sometimes God allows struggle into our lives. Amy Carmichael, a famous missionary to India, she said that life can be difficult. Sometimes the enemy comes in like a flood. But then is the time to prove our faith and to live our song. And the question God asks all of us through this story is, how are you going to respond when threats and obstacles of life begin to mount up against you? What are you going to do when hard times come? What if you lose your job? What if your friends turn your back on you because of your faith? Look at the world we live in today. What if your reputation is tainted because of your faith? What are you going to do? What if you lose your money? I mean, look at the economy we're in today. What if you lose your home? Or your health begins to fail? Would you stand by God in difficult times? Would you serve him in a famine? That's Satan's question to Job, or to God about Job. He said, would Job serve God for nothing? I can just hear Satan up in heaven talking to God about Abram, you know. Of course you blessed him. Of course he serves you. I mean, look how you blessed him. You promised him everything, a land. You promised him a large family. You promised to bless the world through him. I mean, who wouldn't serve you? But you bring a famine into the land. And you watch, he'll curse you to your face. He'll run off to Egypt. I sometimes wonder if Satan is up in heaven talking about us. Can you imagine that? Of course they serve you. Look at all that you've done for them. But you bring a problem. You bring this problem into their life. And you watch. What if he says that about you? You know, the fearful thing that I get from this text, though, the discouraging thing, is how the text answers that question. Because Genesis 12 also shows me something. It shows me that there will be times in our life when we are tested and we fail. You find it in Abram's life. There will be times when we'll take off and we're going to handle life that way. George Mueller, he's another famous devotional writer. He's a lot more than that. But he wrote this. He said, when the trial of faith comes, you know, we're naturally inclined to distrust God in those times and trust rather in ourselves or in our friends or in our circumstances. And we try to work up, Mueller says, a deliverance of our own. And these times that Mueller is referring to, they're times when we lose sight of our walk with God. There are times when we lose sight of who we are, people of faith. We take life into our own hands. And we decide God is not going to come through for us, and so we decide to go it alone. But when that happens, this text serves as a warning that when you turn away from God and you start making decisions on your own, apart from the direction of the Lord, you start responding to the problems and the circumstances of life in fear and not in faith. And that fear is going to eventually lead you to do other things, which eventually lead to other things, and those things will lead to other things. And you begin to come up with some really bad solutions to the problems of life. But as we close this morning, I want to encourage you with something, because even though we fail, this text reminds me that God's faithfulness and his grace always shines through in those times. In times when we turn away from him, we discover through Abraham's failure that our success in life, it does not depend on us. It depends on God. Even when I fall, he doesn't give up on me. He doesn't give up on Abram, and he doesn't give up on you. 2 Timothy 2:3 says this as we close this morning: if we are faithless, he remains faithful. Amen. You might stumble when difficult times come your way. I've done it. But Christian, when you turn back to the Lord, you find every time that God didn't turn his back on you. Amen. You find every time that he never left you, he never forsook you, he was there all along. He doesn't leave us. His love endures. Great is thy faithfulness. Come back next week, if you will. We're going to close in a word of prayer. But I want to show you what happens when you let God choose. Because next week we're going to move into Genesis 13, and we're going to continue this journey of Abraham's life of faith. This time he lapsed. But you know what? When you fall on your face, just get back up and keep going.